Ladies and gentlemen, this is Breakout Session 7, Crisis Communication, a 24-hour response PAO Bootcamp. Our leads for this session are Ms. Carol Hahn, USAID Strategic Communications Team Leader, Ms. Alison Harding, USAID Press Officer, and Mr. Larry Parnell, Professor and Program Director at George Washington University. Please give them a warm welcome.
Okay, good morning, everybody, or I guess I should say good afternoon. I'm Colonel Kathleen Turner. I'm the Media Relations Chief at OCPA, and I want to thank everybody for coming today. We have three fantastic panelists that we're really excited and appreciative for you taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. Our breakout session today is a 24-hour crisis management. At some point in time, we're all going to be affected by a crisis. And just like what our previous presenter was saying, what Melissa was saying, is it an issue, is it a crisis? Today, our focus for our panel is going to be about the whole of government approach. You'll learn about crisis versus issues management, and we're really hoping that we have a great discussion, and from our USAID and our George Washington teammates here is that they give us some good tactics, some techniques that you all can take back and apply to your individual organizations and units and agencies so that we're better communicators in how to handle crisis. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our panel. We've got Ms. Carol Hahn. She is the Strategic Communications Team Leader for USAID's Office of UN Foreign Disaster Assistance, the lead federal office responsible for coordinating the U.S. government's response to international disasters. Ms. Hahn manages a team of press officers, communication specialists based in Washington, D.C. She is also a press officer on several disaster assistance response teams, including West Africa for the U.S. Ebola response and the Philippines for Typhoon Haiyan. She's an award-winning television news journalist for nearly 13 years, covering Capitol Hill and the White House. We also have Ms. Alison Harding, a press and public outreach officer, also with USAID's Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance. Ms. Harding has covered a number of major disaster responses, including Hurricane Matthew in 2016, the complex emergency in Nigeria, Hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017, and the Venezuela regional crisis. She deployed to Mexico City as the press officer on USAID's Elite Disaster Assistance Response Team. She currently covers Latin America and the Caribbean region. Mr. Larry Parnell is an award-winning public relations professional and academic who is an associate professor and director of the George Washington University Masters in Strategic Public Relations program. He built the GW Masters program into one of the best-known and admired programs in the U.S. He operates Parnell Communications, a strategic communications and leadership training advisory firm. And thank you all for being here today. Okay, so we're going to kick off the presentations with Carol, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who came. Can you all hear me? I'm used to holding a mic as a reporter, so I always need to get used to it again. My name is Carol Hahn. I've been with USAID's Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance, leading their communications team for about 7 years. Prior to that, I was on the other side. I was on TV, starting in Fargo, North Dakota for the NBC station, because a girl's got to start somewhere. And I ended up as a Washington correspondent for a whole bunch of TV stations across the U.S. covering the White House. I was recruited by USAID to lead their communications team 7 years ago to tell the story of what the U.S. government and the American people are doing to save lives around the world. And so that is the office for which I serve right now. I just want to go through a little bit for people who are not familiar with OFDA. First of all, we are the U.S. lead government responder to international disaster response. We respond to an average of 65 disasters in more than 50 countries every year, and a lot of those disasters you don't even hear about. They are probably smaller responses, but they still do merit a U.S. government response. And we coordinate the humanitarian activities across the U.S. government. Although we are the lead, we do work alongside local officials in affected countries, as well as with our interagency colleagues such as DOD. Our mandate is a noble one. We save lives, alleviate human suffering, and reduce the social and economic impact of disasters. This covers everything we do, including our messaging. So when we're messaging, including doing crisis communications during a disaster, we frequently go back to these 3 key themes because it makes it very simple, even during a crisis or a disaster, as to what the US government, what American taxpayers, what America is doing in a particular country, no matter how bad things get. 2 of our premier activities that you may or may not have heard about in the news is when the scope and size of a disaster merits it, we will deploy what's called an Elite Disaster Assistance Response Team, or DART. They deploy within hours of an emergency. They assess disasters. They identify humanitarian needs. We pull in other interagency capabilities, such as DoD, as necessary. And then we have, of course, a DC support team, the RMT, to help support. I sometimes think working on the response from the headquarters end, from DC, is even harder. Sometimes you have to shuffle and deal with more crises there, including pressures from the interagency. It's a virtual alphabet soup of interagency partners that we work with. You see some familiar SEALs up there. DoD is a key office with whom we work, in which we request DoD's special capabilities at times to help us in our civilian-led response. These unique capabilities can include technical expertise, logistics capabilities. We only include DoD in approximately 5 to 10% of our disaster responses. It's not a lot, but when we do ask for the unique capabilities of DoD, and that's done through the Office of the Secretary of Defense, it's through a special it's through a special way that we actually formally request DoD assistance. It's usually super high profile, and we have to be working really carefully with DoD to message certain sensitivities, one of them being that this is a civilian-led response. In some of the areas in which we operate, including Africa being one of them, there are sensitivities of it being seen as a DoD-led response. But when DoD brings in its assets, especially its air assets, it's so visual. So we've had the good fortune of working very closely with some of our DoD colleagues, especially with PACOM and to work with, and Southcom on some of our disasters. So remember how I brought up our elite darts. Now is an incredibly busy season. We have 6 simultaneous darts deployed currently. This is the 3rd time in our history in which we're doing so. It takes a lot of man and women power to be deploying those darts. And you could see them kind of up there, but let me go through them really quickly. This is our longest response, going on since 2013. It's when fighting between the Syrian government, opposition forces, and ISIS caused more than 80% of the population to be displaced. This man is actually standing in the exact spot where a Scud missile destroyed his home, immediately killing his family. We have DART members currently on the ground in Syria, Turkey, Jordan, and Kuwait. And we have been working with DoD on its response, who has been helping us deliver emergency food assistance to some of the areas liberated from ISIS. Iraq, our DART has been on the ground since 2014 after ISIS started seizing control of parts of the country. We also have been working with DoD here on the delivery of humanitarian assistance. But the messaging here, as with Syria, is extremely sensitive because of security concerns. We don't want our partners or our personnel on the ground to be killed, and this is one of the sensitivities that we deal with our crisis communications. South Sudan, not a lot of many people remember this one. Been going on since December 2013. Ongoing civil war has left more than half the country facing life-threatening hunger. This is one that's a little bit more recent and has been more in the news. Natural disasters are a little bit easier for us to message because the actual disaster happens and then we can come in and respond. This is cyclones Idai and Kenneth in Mozambique. Kenneth was one of the worst natural disasters to hit southern Africa in about a quarter century. So we still have a disaster assistance response team, or DART, on the ground. This has been a sticky one for those of us who remember Ebola in West Africa, looking at you. The DRC Ebola outbreak is particularly difficult. Not only is it Ebola, but unlike the West Africa Ebola crisis, this is happening in a war zone. And this is, even though the numbers are not as high as a West Africa Ebola outbreak, this makes it extremely difficult to message when our partners are getting killed. And then finally, the Venezuela regional crisis. Nearly 4 million people have fled the economic crisis in Venezuela. We have a DART based out of Colombia, and a regional office in Costa Rica that has been providing robust humanitarian support for the region. There are political sensitivities with this response. So going on to why we message. So a lot of people don't necessarily like working with the media. I don't know if anyone here is going to be raising their hand and be like, we love dealing with crises and dealing with CNN on the other end of the phone. Myself as a reporter, I kind of think of it differently because I've been on the receiving end of it. My colleague Alison here, I hired from CNN, and so I think we have a different perspective that we absolutely need to be engaging with the media for several reasons. One is how, we all know it's called the CNN effect, sorry Alison, but it is called the CNN effect because we've all been there and we know that how a response plays out on TV or the radio will impact the public pressure that we get, especially as press officers. Disasters are the actual #1 reason why my agency gets public news attention. So we need to make sure we are being aggressive and that we are clearly and cogently talking about what we're doing to save lives. And we talked about this. The political pressure that we do get can be immense, and so we have to be clearly messaging what we're doing. Before I hand it off to Alison, I just do want to talk about, and I'm curious, and hopefully we can have a dialogue. It's not getting, even though we do disaster response, and our mandate is really straightforward, our job has not been necessarily getting any easier. All those photos that I showed you about all the different disasters we're responding to, most of them are political crises. They're war. They don't end anytime soon. There is disaster fatigue, and there's also potentiality for crisis, political crisis, that will subsume some of what we're doing on the non-political end. So interested in maybe having more of a dialogue on that, but let me turn it over to Alison to be talking about how we message.
Thanks, Carol. Hi, everyone. My name is Alison Harding. I'm a press officer on Carol's team. And as she mentioned, before that, I was a producer and assignment editor at CNN for about 6 years before I switched sides. So I'm happy to be here to talk to you guys today. So now that we've talked to you about why we message, I just wanted to go through quickly some of the ways that we do put out our messaging. So first, we'll start with some of the main tools that we use, most importantly, our talking points. So as the lead agency for the federal government, it's our job to also lead on interagency messaging. So as soon as we start thinking about or looking at that we might be responding to a disaster, we are disseminating talking points to the interagency to give them the language to use to talk about the response. And this can start actually as early as even monitoring a hurricane. We'll start putting out points saying, we're monitoring the storm, we have disaster experts in the region, and we're ready to respond if needs warrant. We also put out press releases. The bullets aren't going. Okay, I'll just say them. So we put out press releases to announce major response updates, if we're standing up a DART, if we're doing a major airlift to a disaster-affected country. We hold press conferences. If there's a press officer that deploys on the DART, she or he will arrange press conferences to give the media an inside look at what the DART is doing, or will arrange media tours to show the actual response activities. We also have an information support unit that puts out humanitarian fact sheets about our response activities. And this is where we report really the nitty-gritty of the responses. And these are very useful to provide to the media for all of those details that they need for the reporting, and also for when we're messaging to the Hill, because this gives them all of the information they need about our response. We also like to put out infographics. This is a great way to give a big picture but very informative look at what we're doing on the ground, and this is something that we prioritize when we're messaging a response. So we try to get these out early and continue to update it, and this is how we give a big picture look at our activities. We're also more and more using multimedia, so animations, videos, stop motion, graphics, and this is a way to use different forms to tell our story in different ways, and also to engage different audiences who may be more drawn to different types of media. And finally, and probably most importantly, social media, which I'll spend a few more minutes talking about directly. Oh, there we go. Weird. Okay, so we love social media. This is one of the most important things that we do on our team, and I think I probably don't need to tell this group how critical social media is to crisis communications. I think there's a stat that 2/3 of Americans now get some of their news from social media, so it's really important that we're communicating in these forums and making sure that people have access to the information in this way. Obviously, our disaster responses, our active responses are the bread and butter of our social media, and we talk about those heavily on our Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram handles. Follow us if you would like. Embarrassing plug. So what we do is we post aggressively and often when we're responding to disasters on social media, and we have established ourselves as a go-to source on our social media for information about our response activities. We are followed by journalists, by the public, by the interagency, and by Congress, and this is how we talk to them directly about what we're doing. So we have become known as a reliable place for people to get information, and this is also where the interagency looks to for social media that they can amplify on their channels. So we've talked a few times now about how we're the lead agency, and this extends to social media. So not only are we distributing talking points to give people traditional language on how to talk about our responses, we also disseminate the infographics and the other multimedia that I mentioned, as well as draft social media and the stuff that we're putting out on our handles to the interagency, so they have the language and the content to put out to effectively talk about responses that impact their areas of expertise and control. So just to give you a sense, this was from the 2016 Ecuador earthquake. These are just some of the entities that we engaged with to plan and coordinate social media. And that includes tagging them on their accounts, sharing content ahead of time that they can put out directly, and generally making sure that we're all on the same page so that we're presenting a unified message about how the U.S. is responding to a disaster. And I just wanted to wrap up by kind of showing you a real-time example of how this plays out. This is from the 2016 Mexico earthquake. I was there as the DART press officer and working with my counterpart in D.C. who was supporting the response from headquarters. So what we did is as soon as we got an earthquake alert, we put this tweet out saying, "We're aware of this earthquake. We are monitoring the situation to see if we will be responding." Pretty soon it was clear that we would be. We put out extensive talking points and made sure that the State Department, that the embassy, and that everyone who would need them had these points so they could answer questions about what the U.S. was doing for the response. We then decided to deploy a DART, and we announced it on our Facebook page. So this is the post that we put out as soon as the decision was made that we were sending a DART to Mexico. That was followed by a press release that came out from USAID's press shop, which we worked with Legislative and Public Affairs to put out, and that was amplified also by the State Department. And then we announced as soon as the team got on the ground. And this post ended up being the most popular, most liked Facebook post of 2017. So this is really how lots and lots of people are getting information about U.S. activities. This garnered a lot of attention for OFDA. We also worked with the embassy to put out the message in Spanish, so they could be talking to their audiences at the same time. And as soon as we got on the ground, the media was there waiting for us, and we immediately started doing interviews with our rescue teams, coordinating that with the embassy. So this was actually at our base of operations. This is one of the urban search and rescue captains talking to NBC News from the base. And then in the days following, we continued follow-on messaging. This is a press release that the embassy put out about additional funding that we were providing for the response, which we then amplified in Washington. And my favorite, we look for ways to get other attention to the response and kind of present a more human, interesting story along the way. And this, of course, is one of the urban search and rescue dogs, who are always a big hit on social media. That's my friend Tanker. So we also, in the midst of a crisis, we're always looking for creative ways to kind of get people's attention, maybe catch someone's eye who wouldn't necessarily be paying attention to the disaster response, and dogs are always a good way to do that. That's it for me. We just wanted to wrap up by putting in a plug for our Joint Humanitarian Operations course. Some of you may have heard of this or even taken it. This is a course that OFTA started many years ago to specifically give U.S. military the opportunity to learn more about humanitarian response and how DoD works with us on responses. There should be a fact sheet on the digital portal with more information, or you can email that email up on the screen if you'd like to learn more.
Thank you very much. I'm impressed. I appreciate your work you all are doing. I think better on my feet. If you don't mind, I'm going to stand up and move around. So I have some slides. I think they're queued up, yes? So my name is Larry Parnell. I'm a professor at George Washington University. As I tell my students, some of whom are here, some alums here in the room, I'm very pleased about. Before I became a professor, I actually worked for a living doing what you all do on the civilian side, both in Wall Street and campaigns and et cetera. So what I'm going to talk about is sort of, you've heard about disasters, you've heard about issues in crisis management. I'm going to try to get underneath that a little bit and talk to you about some of the theories and strategies behind it and perhaps some ways to look at it as you go forward in your work on behalf of the Army and of us as citizens of this country. So I'm going to focus on the discussion between issues in crisis management, and particularly because I think understanding the differences is very important. You had a good presentation about this before, but I want to really go back and go over a couple of key things that I think are important. First and foremost, I don't think it matters to the client whether it's an issue or a crisis. It's a problem and they want you to solve it. So that's the first order of business. We can get caught up in our own discussions about it, but for the purposes of the client or the civilians or the generals and others you report to, it's a problem, they want it solved. So, okay, so my focus is on issues management, and I'll tell you why. I think there is more value add, there's more benefit to being someone who prevents a fire than being the person who's brought in to put the fire out. So in terms of, from a civilian perspective, it's a career boost. I'm sure it's true perhaps in the military as well. Seeing something coming, solving the problem before it blows up is better than being good at putting the fire out when the fire starts, in my view anyway. So let's define our terms. Issues management is anticipatory. It is an identification of things that are going on in the marketplace, in the base, inside your organization, outside your organization, that might affect your reputation, your business, your conduct of affairs. At its best, it's a form of stewardship. Think of it as risk management. Think of it as an early warning system where you see things coming and you solve the problem or you anticipate it and come up with solutions before it becomes a crisis. If it does become a crisis, you're ahead of the game, and if it doesn't, you've solved the problem. And this is a very important concept that people get sort of caught up in crisis management, but the real value add, in my perspective, is issues management. And we'll talk about crisis in a few minutes, too. So this is a look at how an issue over time becomes a crisis. And what I'm suggesting to you is the value add is in here. If you can be working here, then you don't find yourself over here trying to put out fires and solve problems. This means you have to understand what's going on in your marketplace. You have to understand what's going on in your organization. You have to understand what's going on in the public. You've got to have a 360 view of what's going on out there. That's the role of a public affairs or public relations person, in my view, is to see things coming and address them rather than just react to them when they show up. So this kind of looks at how that cycle goes. And as I said, you want to be over here in the potential and emerging stage and not in the crisis stage. However, things do happen and you do end up in a crisis situation. So let's talk about that in a little more detail. You've had some conversation from the previous speakers about what constitutes a crisis versus a problem or an issue. And I think that's important to just reiterate a little bit here. Most importantly, it's the second bullet, the first and second bullet, that it has the impact, the potential to damage your business or your organization or morale inside your organization, and it will impact the public perception of your organization. That is what makes it a crisis, not necessarily that you are a manufacturing company and a part, you have a shortage that you're not going to be able to deliver on a part that needs to be done by a certain period of time. That's a problem. The crisis is if you don't manage that well and it becomes an issue for your organization. And these sometimes are unpredictable, and that's a part of the problem that we all have to deal with. You've all seen these charts, so I won't spend a lot of time on this except to go back to my point, which is the notion of pre-crisis is very important. Probably, though, I would like to emphasize one thing for you, and that is where most people fall down, in my view, is in the third stage. And that is most people get through the crisis, it's over, and you just say, I'm glad that's done, and you move on. Missed opportunity, big missed opportunity. Number one. Number two, if you're a branch of the service or if you're a bank and you're not Wells Fargo, and Wells Fargo is getting slammed every day in the papers, I will defer to my journalist friends here, but if I'm covering the banking industry and I'm covering Wells Fargo and what's going on there, my second question or my third question is going to be, is this a problem at Citibank? Is this a problem at Chase? So if I work for Citibank and I work for Chase, I better be thinking about this and making sure before I get that phone call, because it's coming. So don't even look at another branch of the service and say, well, I'm glad that's not us. Make sure that's not happening inside your branch, because you're going to get that phone call. So that's important. And in the recovery stage, that's about delivering on the promises you've made. That's about making sure it doesn't happen again. There are three things that people want to know in a crisis situation. What happened? Whose fault is it? And what are you going to do to make sure it doesn't happen again? It's very simple. And the third one is overlooked all too often. What are you going to do to make sure it doesn't happen again? Stuff happens. I get that. Are you going to fix it, or are you just going to hope it doesn't happen again? So your value add is going to be in that third space, asking those questions, even if it's not your company in crisis. I wouldn't be an academic if I didn't give you a little theory. Okay, I don't know if you're all familiar with this theory. It's called image restoration theory. Anybody here study this in school other than Cheryl here who paid attention that day? Okay, I'm going to give you a crash course, and you all get a master's degree on the way out. Not exactly. But maybe a little asterisk on your service record. Benoit's theory is basically that companies go through a series of stages when they're in a situation. Companies, organizations, celebrities, pick one. They're all the same. First thing they do, often is they deny it. It's not us. It's not our fault. It didn't happen. Somebody else is responsible. Somebody outside did this. This notion of shifting the blame is what happens. And then they move across this spectrum. This is not a prescription, by the way. This is more of a track record of how most organizations go through a crisis. So they deny it. They avoid responsibility. Then they try to say, it wasn't that bad. Yeah, it was a crash, but it wasn't our fault because the pilot made a mistake, okay? That doesn't make anybody who's on the plane or who's thinking about flying a Boeing 737 MAX feel any better, does it? No. So then there's this notion of, but look at all the other good things we're doing. So all these things are what companies do, and very often they never get to the last step, which is taking corrective action, accepting responsibility, and making sure it doesn't happen again. So here's your Crisis Communications 101 class from George Washington University, okay? Denial, evasion of responsibility, reducing the offensive act, and then taking corrective action, and maybe mortification. Look at what's going on with Boeing right now. They're still stuck up here in the third stage. They're not really, they're trying to take corrective action, and we can debate and discuss this, but they're not really expressing any responsibility or accepting any responsibility for the problem. They're just trying to make it go away. And that's another thing to keep that in mind. So we can chat about this and some more in the Q&A sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Larry. Okay, so we're going to move to some Q&A right now because I want to make sure we have enough time to get some dialogue going. So if you want, just raise your hand. We got microphones so we can get some questions going to the panel. Okay, well, I'm going to ask the first question. Oh, you got a question. Or Isaac, did you raise your hand? Thank you, Wet Team Chief.
Organizations go into a lot of different countries, and Larry, you've taught a lot of the people who work for government agencies. in communicating with those countries that you're in, how do you go about solving the crisis or identifying the crisis in a communications plan so that you're communicating to the people the way that they receive information? Because a lot of those individuals might not be up on social media or have access to their TVs. So how are you communicating to them that, hey, help is on the way?
Thanks for the question, Isaac. Let me take a first stab at that and open it up to my panelists. I think the point is there's going to be some central messages that I think if you're a good crisis communications professional, you're going to anticipate certain things happening, just as Larry had mentioned. But the point that I wanted to bring up is sometimes even though you're responding to the same disaster or crisis, in our case a disaster, it's tailoring the message as needed to different audiences. So when we go in and respond to a disaster, the international media audience, like the CNNs, the CBS Newses, the NBC, Miguel Almaguer's, are going to be very different than, let's say, the local media, the local news, the local people. We saw this very much in our West Africa Ebola response. We have to handle both. So there are some PAOs, public affairs officers, that might just want to concentrate on the big fish. And I found in my experience that doesn't work so well. Maybe because I started my news career in Fargo, North Dakota, that I always have great sympathy and know how critical it is handling the local and domestic radios. So for Ebola, we did the interviews with CNN, we did those big things, but we also organized specific media roundtables that were they were longer. And there was more discussion, and they did it differently in Liberia with local radio outlets. And we prioritize those as well because it might have been very similar messaging, but it's hitting different audiences, and this will also be very different than the social media audience that you referenced. So that's it from my end. Turning it over to Alison or Larry.
I would just add a little bit to that. I think you've hit on a very important point that everything we do in communications comes down to understanding your audience. Whether it's domestic, international, whatever. So that's first and foremost. Secondly, as you are looking at international challenges, there's two issues I'd like to emphasize. One, understand that different audiences and different markets and different countries get their information in different ways. There may be an issue, access to media, there may be an issue with literacy, so an article in the newspaper may not necessarily be the solution. It may be social media, it may be radio, it may be. So you have to have that local knowledge. And that's important from the perspective of your prep work to make sure you understand which media counts and how people access information. And the third thing that I really think I want to emphasize, especially for those of you who work around the world, is the concept of cultural intelligence. If you're familiar with that, that essentially means awareness of how things work in a given marketplace, especially in a crisis situation. It works both ways. You can have a company like Asiana Airlines, which is a Korean-based company, part of a chaebol there, and they had a crash in San Francisco a couple of years back, and everybody criticized the management for not being there on site because that's the expectation here in the United States, that the CEO will show up, express remorse, and talk about how you're going to solve the problem. Culturally, that's not the way things are done in Korea. But the accident happened in the United States. Conversely, if you're representing the United States government and a branch of the military somewhere in the world, how things work in that part of the world may not be the same thing they work back in the base you started at. So you need to understand that and communicate and target your messaging with the sensitivities of the local community in mind, not the way we do things back home, because it doesn't work that way, and you will look like the quintessential ugly American if you do that.
I would just add one more thing to that, and that's more on a logistical side. The way that we learn about these cultural sensitivities and the way things are done is we rely really heavily on our teams in the field, and we work very closely with the embassies in the affected country, and where USAID has a mission, they often have a communications person on the ground. So we coordinate very closely with them on that so that they can help us tailor the message to the local audience, because there is a very different perspective from the international media and the local media. You know, the CNNs want to know how is USAID's response part of the broader U.S. global geopolitical picture. That's what they're looking at. The local stations are going to help us tell people directly, here's how we're supporting your communities, here's how we're supporting your emergency response activities, and this is what this means for your family. But we're in Washington, so a lot of times that means working with other people in the interagency who do have that knowledge to make sure that we're telling both stories at the same time.
Great, thank you. John?
John Manley, I'm with U.S. Africa Command. We just worked with you guys. Kudos to the DART team and USAID. Yeah, we were working there, but that was my question, is so we're not going to change bureaucracy and the way that we spin up in these things, but the messaging part at the beginning in anticipation, particularly like a cyclone like that coming in, how do we work together better at the beginning, and what would your recommendations be to sort of do the cross-messaging? Because in reality, what ended up happening is, from a DoD perspective, we gave away about 6 days of anticipation and getting some of the negative questions, which, working together with you, we were able to kind of quell. But what we did was we ceded that space to the Chinese. And while we're not fighting the Chinese, and it's a worldwide support, it falls into a greater, the greater power competition kind of issues that go on. So how do we communicate and work with you guys, or how do we speed up, if you will, the bureaucracy, or pre-coordinate some of this stuff in future events or activities, particularly on the continent?
Good question, John. It was a pleasure. We worked with AFRICOM in our recent response to Cyclone Ida and Kenneth in Mozambique. So it's still going on, although the DoD mission has closed. I think this venue is one good way to start. It's just meeting face to face. I think I'm an old-fashioned diplomat and reporter in that way. Some of our closest ties have frankly been with PACOM and with Southcom, because I make it a point, and my team makes it a point, to visit there several times a year, and we have staff there all the time. I think part of it also, every response is really different, so it can't be a one-size-fits-all approach, but I think in sharing best practices and sharing some of our messaging beforehand. To be frank, John, AFRICOM has always been on my list to come and visit the PAO shop there. I know I have to go on over there, but it's prepping, especially since faces change, not only at USAID headquarters, but also at the combatant commands. It's a lot of this old-fashioned, like, shaking hands, getting to know, and it's education, right? I mean, for all of you guys who saw that slide about our Joint Humanitarian Operations class, our JHOC class, I can't really say enough how great that is. We just gave you a small taste of how we work with DoD on disaster responses, on humanitarian assistance and disaster response. So I do think that that's another thing. I think also a big one, and we're always doing lessons learned from my team, John, and I think it's kind of realizing, okay, the next time this does happen, and if we do see a lag, I mean, a lot of the lag was really bureaucratic lag that had nothing to do with the response itself. It had to do with higher-ups signing paperwork for DoD to get off the ground. So I think what we could do, and what we aim to do, and Alison illustrated that really well, is we love helping you guys fill the news void. We know this as correspondents and reporters, so it would be even more so being more aggressive, or calling you guys up and being like, just put this out. I mean, it doesn't have to do with DoD yet, but you can shape it, because people are hungry for information during a very short news window. So that's something that we're discussing now as to what we could do better, and maybe John will be reaching out to our counterparts at AFRICOM to do like a very informal, because we really want to get better at how we could be coordinating. But I'll tell you what, this is a lot better than what it used to be. And we're always learning more. But it's a one unified USG picture of what America is doing to save lives. So all in all, I say it was a good response, but there's things that we can do better for sure.
I know we're kind of short on time, and we got a wrap it up sign from in the back. So I'm going to ask our panelists to give some closing remarks, and then we'll break the session.
Thank you very much. Again, appreciate the opportunity to be here with you, and if I haven't said so before, thank you for your service to us as citizens of this country. I think just a couple things I want to say to you in response. One, understand the purpose of putting the theory up there was so you understand how people actually tend to react in these situations. It's not necessarily a prescription, it's more a way of you thinking about where are we on this chain and what do I need to do to move us forward. But the other thing I want to sort of leave you with is this notion, given the setting we're in, that you need to take aim in a crisis situation and an issue. You've got to anticipate, you've got to identify the problem, and then you've got to minimize the impact on your organization. That's your goal. my perspective. That's what I teach in our classes. That's what I did in my career. And my suggestion to you is if you take aim at a problem, you can minimize its impact on your organization. Thanks very much for your time today. We appreciate it very much.
So I would just wrap up by saying a lot of the work that goes into crisis comms actually happens outside of the actual crisis. So for Carol's team that I have joined in the last 2 years, she's put a lot of work into establishing OFDA as a go-to resource for information on disaster response and as the lead in the agency for messaging disaster response. And that happens outside of an active disaster. So that is visiting the COCOMs to have those conversations ahead of time so that you know to come to us directly. And that's working with State Department to make sure that they understand that they can come to us when they have questions about what we're doing and that we'll be providing them with what they need when that crisis hits, and that the public knows that they can follow at the OFDA and they'll get real-time updates about what we're doing. So we have established ourselves as the resource, so when there is a crisis, people know where to turn to get the information that they need.
And I just like to end by saying it's no brainer that coordination is key during a crisis communications event. If I could also put in a plug, which is a little bit odd for a public affairs officer to be doing so, I've always found as a journalist and also on the other end is being straightforward as possible as you can is generally a good recipe. People can smell BS out there and it sometimes gets us in trouble. And the last thing is happy to continue the dialogue. Please feel free to come up and say hi after. I don't want to get into your lunch here, but please feel free if you have any other questions or want to continue this dialogue another time. Love meeting new people, love swapping stories, and thank you so much on behalf of all of us for this opportunity.
Hey, thank you, everybody. I do want to put a plug in for USAID's classes. We have sent folks from ACPA to those classes in working hurricanes, and they were really valuable and gave some good TTPs and best practices that we are using in ACPA, so please take advantage of those. Thanks, everybody.
Sorry, that's okay. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Ms. Harding, Ms. Hahn, and Mr. Parnell. It's now lunch, and then we'll see you back in here at 1400. Thank you.